Joe Donofrio, producer for the Celebration of Life of Pat Martino. I had managed Pat for, well, in January, it will be 25 years that I managed Pat. And I'm just thrilled that all the musicians are coming in to pay tribute to Pat. I'm excited, and hopefully everybody will enjoy it as well. And I know Pat's smiling down on us. So I met, as I mentioned earlier, Pat Martino through John Mulhern. John Mulhern was a friend of mine. Um, I live on an island right outside of Atlantic City. It's called Brigantine, and John was living in Atlantic City, and I knew John had a close relationship with Pat. So every time I would see John, I'd say, "How's Pat doing?" Because I loved Pat's playing, and I always wanted to meet him. And one day he said to me, let's have a meeting. Would you like to meet Pat and we'll talk about a few things?" I said, "Of course." So we did. We had a meeting right here in Brigantine, New Jersey. There used to be a diner here. And the three of us met and we talked for a couple hours. And initially, Pat was looking more for an agent than a manager. And at the end of it, I said, "Look at Pat, I'm not a booking agent. That's not what I do. But if you want to try for a year, I will take you on as a manager. And let's give it a year. After a year, we can look at each other and see if we want to continue." And here we are 25 years later. That's how I met Pat. And I think why we stuck together was more of after, I'd say, the first 2 years, he became to trust me with, through the process every day of working through things and talking about things. He began to trust me. And as soon as that happened, then we began to move forward. And we went off and running.
I'm Bill Milkowski. I'm a longtime writer for Downbeat magazine. I was the co-author of the Pat's autobiography, Here and Now. And I've known Pat for a long time. I met him in 1977 and over time have written about him and actually got to produce an album he did, his first Blue Note album, All Sides Now. So it's a long-standing relationship, and he was a friend and a hero to me, and I'm glad we're all coming together to pay tribute to him at this great event. He asked me. He felt that he could trust me, I think. We had a friendship. I had a long-standing relationship with Pat going back to when I first met him in 1977. This was right after Joyous Lake had come out. I was living in Milwaukee at the time, and I noticed that Pat was going to be playing in Madison, about 90 miles away. And so I was determined to go, thinking that I was going to see the Joyous Lake Band. So I get to the gig, and it's at a nightclub restaurant, and it's just Pat and Bobby Rose playing duets, which was amazing. I walked into the club, they're playing 4 on 6, and I'm like, yeah, but I was expecting this more fusion band. This was at the time, I think Joyous Lake came out maybe shortly before and maybe at the same time as Weather Report's Heavy Weather. So that music was sort of in the air, and I was completely charged by it. And drove to Madison expecting to see Joyous Lake, and got instead swinging guitar duo playing Wes Montgomery, which was great. I was sort of at that point, well, let's say I was involved with jazz guitar for maybe 5 or 6 years at that point. Was a big fan of Joe Pass and other guitar players before I ever heard Pat on record. So seeing the gig was great, but afterwards I went to talk to him just to say hi and tell him how much I loved the gig. And I was surprised at how forthcoming he was. His voice at that time, like I was telling you, Pat, his voice was like an octave lower than it ended up being later on. And it was this incredibly mysterious person, this thin cat with this super low voice. He not only engaged me in conversation after the gig, he said, "Why don't you come back to the hotel?" Right? And I'm just a kid who likes jazz guitar, who drove to see him. So next thing I know, I'm in Pat's hotel room, and I had a tape recorder, and I recorded a conversation. He talked for about 90 minutes. And it was very, I mean, it was like way over my head. It was about sacred geometry and the 12-pointed star theory on the fretboard and things that were entrancing to me, but way over my head. And I still have that tape. I remember passing it around on the Milwaukee scene to all the jazz guitar enthusiasts in town to listen to this, because it was putting a philosophical approach to the instrument from this cat who was speaking with sort of combining Easter philosophy and the I Ching and other aspects that no one had considered before. So that was my first encounter with Pat. Some years later, I moved to New York in 1980 and, had heard about the aneurysm. But then I actually saw him in Cape May when he was playing some local comeback gigs at small, low-profile places under his real name, Pat Azara, and happened to know that that was his actual name, and he was playing under that for a while in this very localized comeback. So I went and saw him. He sort of didn't remember me, but I rekindled a friendship in that point, and then later saw him when he played at the Bottom Line. I think it was 84 maybe, opening for Stanley Clarke, a local Philly legend himself, who got Pat to open for him at this showcase gig. And that sort of led to his album, The Return, which was a live at Fat Tuesdays. At that time, I lived a few blocks away from Fat Tuesdays. This was in 87. So this is 10 years after I initially met him. He played live at Fat Tuesdays with Steve Laspina and Joey Barrett on drums. And that became his album, The Return. I had a deep conversation with him backstage at that gig and maintained this friendship with him, got to interview him over time, and eventually Bruce Lundvall asked me to produce this record for Blue Note, All Sides Now. I was actually living in New Orleans at the time. Bruce called me up and said, "We've just signed Pat Martino. We're going to, introduce him to the label with, we want to do a tribute album, have a different guitarist on each track, paying tribute to Pat in engaging in the two guitar thing. And we want you to produce it," which was great and thrilling, but laying an impossible job on me, because up until that point, Pat had only ever rehearsed bands, went into the studio, hit it really quickly, a day, maybe two at the most. And this project, because it was in a different city all over the country, took about a year. And this is not the way he was used to recording. And I think it was a very trying process for him. In some cases, he said it was like having to manufacture chemistry on the spot, which was foreign to him. He usually had his guys that he had already toured with and had chemistry, and they just went into documents. So this was sort of a prefabricated situation, but he responded nicely to it, and there were some great results on it, and we had fun and good times and making that record. His sense of humor, of course, everyone can attest to. He's this Zen master on the one hand, but this streetwise cat on the other hand. and he's got some of that humor was coming out on the session. And, you know, he enjoyed our companionship, and we stayed in touch on the phone and other ways. And anytime he had a gig in New York, I was down for it, and we, you know, got to hang. And at the point that this book was in the works, Joe, you were already on the scene, and you were very instrumental in getting me involved. But, you know, it was basically, I remember having a meeting, it might have been at the Brigantine Diner with you and Pat, and you guys, like, you know, little coffee with the Sambuca in there in the morning, and we were, so, you want to do this book? And I was on board from that point. Maybe you can recall that meeting and how I became involved, because...
Well, yes, we both, Pat and I, were fans of Bill's. And, you know, we loved his work. And when we started to talk about the book, a couple things were in the making as far as who was going to write it. And Pat had certain ideas how he wanted it to go. And I did suggest to Pat, which he agreed, we should have Bill Milkowski do this book. I think he's the perfect guy for you. And he knows you have a relationship, he writes great, let's do it. And he said, I'm in. And off we went.
It was cool. It was a process of me taking the bus to Philly, to the train station, Pat picking me up in his leased Cadillac, taking me back to his home. We'd sit on the couch in his living room for, like, man, 3-4 hours straight without dropping a beat. Break for dinner, we'd either go out, or Aya, his wife, would make sushi rolls, like hand make all this stuff. And then after eating, having a taste, we'd go back to the couch and hit 3 more hours. You know, I'd stay in a hotel, I'd come back the next day. I did that several times, and the thing, my role really was, Pat, like Joe, like you say, he had an idea about it, what he wanted to do. And initially, I think he wanted to do a self-help book for people to explain ways that they can improve their health, improve their outlook on their life. And he was very much invested in that concept. So it was my duty to pull him back into the realm, you know, because left to his own devices, Pat could get very ethereal, esoteric, philosophical, and I was pulling him back to reality with questions like, disarming questions like, so Pat, what kind of shoes did Jack McDuff have? You know, and that would trigger him into memories of Small's Paradise and the scene there and what was going on there. And then he would have deep, detailed memories of that scene, very vivid, and I was able to incorporate that into the book, try to maintain some kind of a chronology of his incredible life, you know, beginning from the time when his father Mickey was taking him as a 13-year-old kid down to the corner barbershop to play for everybody. You know, check out my kid, he can play Moonlight in Vermont, you know. And from that to riding on the bus when he was 16 with Lloyd Price and Red Holloway and all those cats. On and on. It's an incredible story. And I was trying to maintain some kind of integrity with that story, while also getting Pat to comment on what he wanted the book to represent, which is this self-help attitude, this holistic approach to music and life itself. So it was an interesting balancing act, and I think it came out to be a very, really interesting book that does incorporate Pat's ideas about things, worldly and otherworldly, and also represents his very incredible journey on the planet.
My name is Pat Bianchi, and I'm a jazz organist, and I had the honor of being a member of Pat's band for almost 9 years. And aside from being a band leader to me, Pat actually became a very close friend, a mentor, and somebody I looked up to very much in many ways. So for me, it's a very, very special time to be able to celebrate Pat's life, and a privilege to be included in this event.
Absolutely. Pat, you need to turn your... Okay, good.
Yeah.
Pat, how was playing with Pat Martino different than with other musicians?
I think at first, for me, it was terrifying because I've known about Pat, I mean, since my early college years, if not before, and I knew he was a legend, and everything that he had played on these, especially the earlier records, it's just always it blew my mind. And the notion of not only being on the bandstand with him as a musician, but being an organ player, having to do bass lines, comping, and then the dreaded notion of having a solo after him sometimes, it was daunting at first. You know, it was truly a daunting experience. And the first thing I could say without a doubt is it had made me a stronger musician. It also taught me to listen in different ways, and especially with somebody like Pat. He had, you know, it would be, I think it's an interesting thing, Bill, I mean, since you've listened and you've been involved with Pat so much, would you agree that his vocabulary was different in the earlier years than the later years? Because I kind of feel like it was, but I know you were there for a lot of instances.
One thing I noticed was you listen to the early albums, whether it's El Hombre 67, or even his stuff with Gene Ludwig, which came out much later as Young Guns, but that was from live recordings from '68. The impression is mind-blowing. The acceleration of his lines, the drive is just, it's remarkable. Of course, he's young. He's 22, 23. Later on, hearing Pat, I was, maybe this speaks more about me aging and maturing with my ears. Initially, I was blown away by the sheer facility and the acceleration of lines of Mr. PC on Consciousness and that kind of thing. Later on, I was more blown away by the depth of feeling and soul in him playing Round Midnight or any ballad. And just like you could hear him pouring his life force into each note. And it took on this blue, dark blue, almost a purple quality when he would play ballads. And I don't know, I think he didn't rely on that acceleration, or maybe the facility had been diminished because of the aneurysm. But what I came away appreciating more later on, and I remember seeing this over that course of the week in Umbria when he was playing with Rick Germanson, because I was seeing him every day, consecutive days, was just that, man. He poured so much soul and life force into each note on playing a ballad. He gave so much authority. There's more space between the notes, and therefore more authority on each one that he played. And it was profound. It knocked me out as much as hearing him play with such dazzling facility early on in his career.
Yeah, I could definitely understand what you're saying, and I agree for sure. And I think one thing from my perspective that I realized is really listening in a different way than I had listened to when I would play with other musicians who, you know, would be playing, I wouldn't say more typical lines and or bebop or however you want to define it. It's like sometimes you never knew what direction Pat was going to take something. And I felt it was a responsibility of mine to always be to the best of my ability right there with him. If he's going to change to a different chord substitution, if he's going to play something where he wants a lot of space, or if he's going to play where he wants me to only hold a chord and move the Leslie, these things that would, you know, this is like when that tune counts off, my only focus was just him and playing underneath him as a support. So it was an education because it opened up my ears in different ways than playing gigs and other gigs in the past. So that was a huge influence for me, I think at least.
That makes me think of something I was checking out yesterday. Of course, we know that Johnny Smith was a big influence on Pat, and I think what that was about was the cleanliness, the articulation of the notes. I was listening to some Johnny Smith yesterday, including that great solo guitar album, Blue Guitar. It's just impeccable picking, and I can hear that quality in Pat's playing, and I can hear, that's what he emulated. He really dug Johnny Smith. However, what you were talking about is Pat also had this unexpected thing where he would throw a monkey wrench into the situation, and where that's coming from, I think, is his other big influence, Les Paul. Because if you hear Les ever, even when he was 80 something, he'd be playing a standard and go off somewhere, and the musicians had to follow him.
Yep.
And it was playful, it was a little quirky, it was always unpredictable. He might have got that from Les, but Pat definitely would go off the beaten path, not just play angular lines, but his rhythmic approach on what he was doing would suddenly take on a different life, and you had to follow him. And I heard that many live situations, and I can only imagine that you had to be on your toes to be on the bandstand with Pat.
For sure. And he knew exactly when he was going in those spots, obviously, too, especially when he would play something like that. And, generally speaking, a lot of times I would be to his right. And so just as an emulation, he's playing, he would do something like that, and all of a sudden you'd see his head turn with like a smirk. And it's like, okay, it wasn't a glare, it was a smirk. So, but having to be in those kind of moments with somebody with so much at their disposal, it forces you to be on your game all the time and always step up. Because that's another thing I think I learned with Pat is no matter what the circumstance, you step up. I remember we played a gig in Colorado, and it was at higher elevation. He was having a hard time breathing. And, we both, Carmen and I, said, Pat, just do what you can. If we have to play longer to keep the set going, don't overdo it. Your health is the most important thing. We'll get through this. And so we get up on the bandstand, and he proceeds to play a non-stop 2-hour set. His determination and his authority on it, it's just like, no, this is what it's going to be. And everybody rises up to that. And that's something I truly admire about him is I obviously didn't know him when he had his aneurysm. I know the stories, and Pat and I had talked about it. Joe, we've talked about it. His determination, but to be witness to that in real time, this is like, no, this is going to happen, and I'm going to do it 100 times harder with more effort than ever just to do it and say I can do this. So.
You know what?
I'd like to say something about it.
Okay, go.
Bill, you alluded to Pat's tenacity.
Yeah.
So there was a time where Pat had a lot of free time on his hands, and I got a call from somebody out of Nashville, and he wanted Pat to play on these band in the box type things. And Pat's, I don't know if I want to do that. And then he thought about it, and he said, I have obligations like everybody else, so if they could pay the price, then we'll do it. So the price was significant. The guy agreed, and I didn't know him from Adam, neither did Pat. So we take it on, and he needed a studio in Philadelphia. So a good friend of mine, Joe Tarsia's son, Michael, who's since passed away, was a great engineer, award-winning, Grammys, platinum records, whatever. He did more in the R&B type. He was he worked at the Sound of Philadelphia, Sigma Studios, but Michael was wonderful. So I said, Pat, I know Michael. I feel good about putting you with him, and they did it. About a year later, I get email from Michael Tarsia saying, I just have to say something to you, Joe. And I just want to do this about Pat Martino. And so and it was a long email. And he said that he never witnessed anybody with the tenacity that Pat had to come into the studio. And it wasn't just 5 songs, 6 songs. He said there might have been, he was there for 5 hours straight playing tune after tune after tune. He said he never once stopped. He just went right for it. He said, I thought he was going to fall over. We were all getting tired, and Pat just hung in there. Now, don't get me wrong, he told me a lot about it a little later, and it was over with. He made his money, but I was so impressed with how he had so much tenacity. He could have laid down. He could have said, no, I'm not, this is all I'm doing. But Michael Tarsia said he was incredible. He just would not stop. He just went for the throat. He got it all done. It came out perfect. So that was just to address what both of you were saying about his tenacity and he would get up and I said this several times. My analogy was, if he was a boxer and it's the 12th round, the last round, and there's a few seconds left, he's going to knock you out. That's where his mentality was. He wasn't going to give up. He was a fighter. He wanted to do what he was supposed to do, and he wouldn't lay down. I've never seen him lay down, and probably Pat could attest to that as well. He just did what he had to do,